The airport was bustling with people coming and going, the sounds of conversations blending with the rolling of suitcases on the floor and the echoing announcements from the loudspeakers. Amid the hurried crowd, Margaret Sinclair, a 70-year-old woman, walked with a composed and serene demeanor. She was not in a rush like the other passengers, nor did she carry the impatience of those eager to reach their destination. Having been through countless journeys in her life, she understood there was no reason to be frantic. Draped over her shoulders was a light blue shawl, and she wore an elegant, neatly pressed dress. Her silver hair was styled in a classic bun. Everything about her exuded the grace of someone who had experienced too many ups and downs to be unsettled by trivial matters. In one hand she held a simple leather bag, while the other pulled a compact suitcase. Upon reaching the priority area for first-class passengers, she gently handed her ticket to the ticket agent. The young staff member, with a courteous smile, scanned her ticket and politely wished her a pleasant flight. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Sinclair. Wishing you a wonderful journey." She nodded slightly, appreciating the young man's kindness, then continued walking. Margaret strolled along the jet bridge leading to the plane. Inside the first-class cabin, passengers were already settled, some adjusting their blankets, others sipping glasses of wine. The air carried the scent of new leather mingled with a hint of delicate perfume. She walked to seat 1B and gently placed her handbag under her feet. Before she could sit down, a voice interrupted the quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am." Margaret turned to see a tall flight attendant standing in front of her. Danielle Calloway had the demeanor of someone who expected to be obeyed. Her uniform was impeccably crisp, yet her expression carried a hint of displeasure. Margaret gave a polite nod. "Is there a problem?" Danielle's gaze flicked to the boarding pass still in Margaret's hand. "This is the first-class cabin," she said as if explaining something complex. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. "I know." Danielle hesitated briefly, then extended her hand. "May I see your ticket again?" Without a word, Margaret handed it to her. Danielle examined it closely, her eyes narrowing. The name on the ticket matched the seat, yet she still seemed doubtful. Finally, she returned the boarding pass with a forced smile. "Just a routine check." Margaret nodded, fully aware of what was happening. This wasn't the first time someone assumed she didn't belong somewhere. She calmly took her seat, adjusted her shawl, and turned her gaze toward the window. A few minutes passed as the last passengers boarded, and the overhead compartments were gradually closed. Margaret reached for her handbag to retrieve a book when Danielle returned. This time, her smile was even more strained, as if she were struggling to contain her frustration. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I need you to leave this seat." Margaret turned to her slowly. "Leave?" Danielle crossed her arms, her tone firm. "It seems there's been a mistake. This seat is not available for you." Margaret straightened slightly. "My ticket clearly states seat 1B. Danielle let out an impatient sigh. "I know, but—" She glanced around as if searching for the right words, then lowered her voice. "This seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger." A tense silence settled over them. A few passengers shifted slightly, pretending not to listen, but it was clear they were paying attention. Margaret took a deep breath. Her entire life had been dedicated to teaching students to stand up for themselves, to raising a family that understood the value of dignity. She had no intention of backing down now. "And what kind of passenger am I?" Her voice was calm, unwavering. For a split second, Danielle's expression faltered. Margaret raised a hand, cutting her off. "If there's truly an issue with my seat, I want to hear it directly from the captain." Danielle's jaw tightened. She looked like she was about to protest when another voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" A younger flight attendant, who had been observing from the galley, stepped forward. Emily Reed watched them with a concerned expression. Unlike Danielle, her worry seemed genuine. Danielle spun around, her voice stiff. "There's no issue," she said firmly. "I was just asking Mrs. Sinclair to move." "Move where?" Emily frowned. Danielle froze. The economy cabin was already full. She had assumed Margaret would leave quietly without questioning it. But now, with another crew member witnessing the exchange, she had no way out. Margaret remained firmly in her seat. "I'm not going anywhere." Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line, clearly struggling to contain her frustration. Then suddenly she grabbed Margaret's arm. "Listen here, you old—" Smack. The slap was swift and sharp, the sound echoing through the first-class cabin, freezing everyone in place. A wave of shock rippled through the cabin. Some passengers whipped their heads around, others sat frozen in disbelief. Danielle stood motionless, her hand still raised as if even she couldn't believe what she had just done. Margaret's head tilted slightly from the force of the slap, but when she turned back to look at Danielle, there was no anger on her face, no outrage, just disappointment. The entire first-class cabin fell into a heavy silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Emily, the younger flight attendant, had gone pale. Her mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. Margaret said nothing. She simply lowered her gaze, picked up her phone, typed a brief message, then set it down beside her. With unwavering composure, she folded her arms and waited. Danielle had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Her breaths came fast, chest rising and falling as she stared at Margaret. She hadn't meant to do that, or at least she hadn't meant to do it in front of so many people. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others murmured among themselves, while a few pretended as if they hadn't seen anything at all. Emily looked as if she had just witnessed a nightmare. Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. Danielle whipped around, panic flashing in her eyes as they darted across the cabin. She wouldn't listen, she muttered, as if trying to justify it to herself. Margaret calmly set her phone down on the armrest. She didn't touch her cheek, didn't cry out. She simply watched Danielle with the same unwavering gaze she had held from the very beginning. Emily clenched her fists, her voice growing stronger. "You just hit a passenger." Danielle spun around, her eyes flaring with anger. "This isn't your business, Emily." The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. A man sitting across the aisle cleared his throat as if about to speak but quickly looked away, avoiding everyone's gaze. Danielle's eyes flickered toward him. Several other passengers had their phones out. It wasn't clear if they were recording or just pretending to be busy. But Margaret didn't need them to speak up. She understood situations like this all too well. When confronted with conflict, most people chose silence to avoid trouble. She had witnessed this far too many times before. Danielle took a step back, smoothing out her uniform as if fixing her appearance could erase what had just happened. "I'm asking you to move," she repeated, but her voice no longer carried the same firmness. Margaret remained silent. Danielle's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Fine, if you won't comply, I'll call security." With that, she spun around and strode quickly toward the front of the plane. Emily remained frozen for a moment, then hurriedly crouched down beside Margaret. "Are you okay?" Margaret gave a slight nod. "I'm fine." Emily hesitated. "Should I call someone?" Margaret glanced at the phone in her hand. "I already did." Emily blinked, confused. "Call who?" Margaret simply smiled enigmatically without answering. She gently lifted her handbag and placed it neatly on her lap. Meanwhile, at the front of the cabin, Danielle had reached the intercom panel near the cockpit. She pressed the button, her voice strained as she tried to sound professional. "Captain, we have an issue in first class. A passenger is refusing to leave a seat that doesn't belong to her. I need ground security to remove her before takeoff." Pause. Then the captain's voice came through the speaker. "Passenger's name?" Danielle let out an exasperated sigh. "Margaret Caldwell." Silence. Danielle frowned. "Captain?" Another long pause. Then the intercom crackled again. Danielle felt her stomach tighten. This time, the voice that responded was not the captain's. It was deeper, calmer, but carried a chilling sense of authority. "This is Charles Caldwell. Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Danielle's stomach clenched. Her finger hovered over the intercom button, but she couldn't press it. She couldn't move. Emily, still kneeling beside Margaret, exhaled softly. As realization dawned on her, she murmured almost unconsciously, "Oh no." Danielle swallowed hard. "Charles Caldwell." She repeated, as if saying the name out loud would somehow change something. The voice on the other end remained sharp, unwavering. "That's right. My wife, Margaret Caldwell. The woman you just laid hands on." Passengers who had previously pretended not to notice now snapped their heads up. A wave of tension crashed through the cabin, heavier than ever before. Danielle's entire body went cold. She had no idea what she had just done. Her hands started to tremble as she backed away from the intercom panel. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Charles Caldwell. That name alone was enough to send her entire body into panic. Danielle had worked for this airline for years, long enough to know exactly who held the real power behind the company. And Charles Caldwell, he wasn't just a shareholder. He was the largest shareholder. The man who had built this airline from the ground up. The man who could end anyone's career with a single phone call. Her throat went dry. She had just slapped his wife. The passengers in the first-class cabin were no longer pretending to be indifferent. Some shifted uneasily in their seats, while others stared outright, waiting to see what would happen next. The intercom crackled again. This time, Charles Caldwell's voice was even calmer, but also colder. "Miss Calloway." Silence hung in the air like a blade. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. No more titles, no more formality, just her last name, spoken with quiet authority. Then movement at the front of the cabin. The cockpit door opened slightly and Captain Pierce stepped out. His expression was unreadable as he motioned toward Danielle. "Come with me." Danielle's legs felt like lead. She hesitated for a second, but there was no choice, she had to follow. As soon as the door shut behind them, the first-class cabin fell into a tense silence. Margaret remained seated, composed as if nothing had happened. Emily stood nearby, her eyes still fixed on the cockpit door, clearly shaken. A few passengers murmured to one another, some casting glances at Margaret with newfound respect, while others simply waited to see what would happen next. A few minutes later, the cockpit door opened again. But this time only Captain Pierce emerged. Danielle was nowhere to be seen. The captain took a deep breath, then spoke in a voice that wasn't loud but carried undeniable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the earlier incident. The situation has been handled. This flight will proceed as scheduled." Then Captain Pierce turned to Eloise, giving her a slight nod. "Mrs. Gardner, would you like to switch seats?" Eloise offered a small but firm smile. "No need, Captain. I'm perfectly comfortable where I am." Captain Pierce pressed his lips together, then nodded. "Very well." He turned to Emily. "Ms. Reed, make sure Mrs. Gardner is well taken care of." Emily immediately nodded. "Yes, Captain." And so, as the flight continued, the passengers gradually returned to normal. But everyone knew that a career had just ended right then and there. Several hours later, when the plane landed, an internal memo from the airline began circulating. Danielle Calloway, terminated immediately. In the dimly lit office, Danielle clenched her jaw, knowing there was no way out. She swallowed hard, eyes downcast. I didn't mean to." Her voice trembled. Captain Pierce folded his arms, his tone icy. "Didn't mean to?" He let out a dry chuckle. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Richard Hale nodded in agreement. "We're not just talking about suspension, Calloway. You assaulted a passenger, and not just any passenger. Mrs. Gardner isn't just Charles Gardner's wife, she's one of the largest shareholders of the company." Danielle felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the cockpit. She had known who Charles Gardner was. But now, hearing it directly from the airline's leadership, she truly understood just how grave a mistake she had made. Pierce stared directly at her, his voice sharp. "I'll be blunt. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. When we land, you will be escorted off the plane. As for the legal consequences..." He paused, glancing at Richard Hale through the screen. Richard nodded and spoke plainly. "The Gardner family has every right to press charges for assault. I suggest you hire a lawyer immediately." Danielle trembled, her entire body frozen. She wanted to protest, to beg, but no words came out. Captain Pierce stood up, opening the cockpit door. "You may return to your seat until we land. But understand this, from this moment on, you are no longer a flight attendant." Danielle stumbled out, her eyes hollow. She had lost everything in an instant. As she walked back to first class, she avoided everyone's gaze. No one said a word, but they all knew. Eloise Gardner remained seated, calm, her hand resting on her handbag, as if she had known from the very beginning how this would end. Danielle realized her mistake. "No, what I meant was..." She hurriedly corrected herself. "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to enforce the seating policy," and she refused to comply. Captain Pierce sighed, shaking his head. "Enough." Danielle bit her lip, her chest tightening. "Captain, I can apologize. I can go back out there and..." Richard's voice cut through the static of the intercom. "It's too late." Danielle's hands turned ice cold, her palms sweating. Captain Pierce leaned back in his seat, his voice calm but commanding. "We have received direct orders from Mr. Gardner. You are immediately suspended from duty for the remainder of this flight." Danielle's heart seemed to stop for a moment. What?" Richard continued, his tone unwavering. "When we land, you will not be joining the crew for the debriefing. Instead, you will be escorted to the administrative office for a formal investigation." Danielle felt the world spin around her. You're suspending me?" Captain Pierce locked eyes with her, his gaze cold as steel. "We don't make the rules here, Miss Calloway. Charles Gardner is the one who decides." Danielle's fingernails dug into her palms, her stomach twisting so violently that she thought she might throw up. Pierce nodded toward the door. You will now return to first class, collect your belongings, and take a seat in the crew section at the back of the plane. You are not permitted to interact with passengers for the remainder of the flight. Danielle froze. Never had she been ordered to sit in the crew area like a dismissed trainee. It was humiliating. She parted her lips, about to protest, but the captain's next words crushed any argument left in her mind. If you refuse, he said slowly, I will have the air marshal on this flight strip you of your duties immediately. Danielle felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. The air marshal. There was no way out. No excuse could fix this. With a shaky, ragged breath, she forced herself to nod. Her hands trembled as she turned and stepped toward the door. Captain Pierce didn't bother looking at her. Richard Hale remained silent. The door shut behind her. As Danielle walked through first class, every passenger who had witnessed the incident turned to look at her. Her face burned with shame, her head lowered. Never before had she been so publicly humiliated. And worse, she had a terrible feeling. This was only the beginning of her downfall. She walked stiffly down the aisle, fists clenched at her sides. She could feel every gaze drilling into her. Whispers began the moment she left the cockpit. She's the one who slapped that passenger. Did you see the captain's face? She's done for. I heard she got suspended on the spot. Danielle's chest tightened. She had always prided herself on controlling situations, on asserting her authority. But now, she was no longer the one enforcing the rules, she was the one being humiliated in front of the very people she used to look down on. She reached for her bag in the crew storage compartment, but her fingers trembled. Years of building her status, years of establishing her reputation, and now she had been reduced to this. Emily stood a few steps away, watching with a complex expression. She hadn't said a word since Danielle left the cockpit, but the look in her eyes said it all. Danielle turned to leave without speaking, her head bowed as she walked through first class. But before she could disappear, a voice rang out, stopping her in her tracks. Miss Calloway. Her stomach twisted violently. She turned around slowly, already knowing who had spoken. Eloise Gardner was still in her seat, the same seat she had never once left from beginning to end. Her posture was straight, her hands neatly resting on her lap. She had never raised her voice, never lost her composure, and yet, somehow, she was the one who had complete control over the situation. Danielle forced a stiff smile. Yes, Mrs. Gardner? Eloise looked at her for a long moment, then in the calmest, slowest voice she asked, Do you still think I don't belong in that seat? The words felt like a slap across the face. Danielle opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The surrounding passengers had fallen completely silent, waiting for her response. Eloise's gaze remained steady, patient. I want to hear your answer, she said. Danielle felt her entire body tense. She knew the right answer. She knew she should apologize, bow her head, and beg for forgiveness. But her pride, her damn pride, wouldn't let her do it. She swallowed hard. I made a mistake. Eloise gave a small nod as if she had already predicted that weak response. Then she simply said, I hope you won't make that mistake again. Danielle's fingers clenched tightly around the strap of her bag. Without another word, Eloise turned back to the window, completely ignoring her. This time, the passengers did not bother to hide their reactions. Some looked satisfied, others shook their heads, and a few even whispered, Serves her right. Danielle's humiliation was complete. She turned around and walked away, each step feeling heavier as she made her way toward the crew seating at the back of the plane. And then a terrifying thought struck her. She wasn't afraid of what would happen when the plane landed. She was afraid of what Charles Gardner was planning next. Danielle reached the rear of the plane, her breath unsteady, fingers clenched tightly around her bag. She had never felt so small and exposed. Every step she had taken down the aisle had been a walk of public disgrace, and she could still feel the weight of the passengers' eyes pressing down on her back. She dropped into the crew seat, her uniform suddenly feeling stiflingly tight. The roar of the engines filled the space around her, but it couldn't drown out the chaotic thoughts in her mind. Never had she been removed from duty mid-flight. Even when dealing with the most difficult passengers, she had always been the one in control, the one who set the rules. But now, she was nothing more than a disgraced crew member, sitting in the back like a rookie on their first day. Emily appeared near the galley, hesitating. She lingered for a moment before speaking. Are you okay? Danielle clenched her jaw. I don't need your pity. Emily sighed, leaning against the storage unit. Emily folded her arms and leaned against the storage unit. This isn't pity, she said. I just don't think you realize how bad this situation really is. Danielle glared at her. I know exactly how bad it is. Emily shook her head, her voice dropping lower. You slapped the wife of the airline's owner. She tilted her head, her gaze serious. You didn't get a warning. You weren't called into a disciplinary meeting for a slap on the wrist. You're being erased. Danielle froze. They can't fire me without due process. Emily let out a dry chuckle. This isn't a normal situation, Danielle. This isn't just a minor seating mistake. You put your hands on someone, and not just anyone. You hit Eloise Gardner. Danielle opened her mouth to argue, but what could she possibly say? Emily leaned in slightly, her voice growing even more serious. Don't you see? She didn't scream. She didn't make a scene or demand anything. She just sat there, sent a single message, just one. Emily paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued, her tone slow, deliberate, like a warning. And now you're sitting here, stripped of your position. She locked eyes with Danielle. What do you think is waiting for you when we land? Danielle felt her throat go dry. That was exactly what she had been trying to ignore. Because deep down she knew that Charles Gardner was not the kind of man to simply let this go. Danielle clenched her jaw. Maybe I can fix this. Emily raised an eyebrow. How? Danielle took a deep breath, as if trying to convince herself more than Emily. Maybe if I apologize, really apologize, he won't take things as far as firing me. Emily tilted her head, her gaze sharp. And you think an apology is enough? Danielle hesitated. She wanted to believe it would be, but something about the way Charles Gardner had spoken over the intercom made her shiver. The cold, measured tone in his voice unsettled her. Emily glanced toward the front of the plane. You'd better hope for more than just an apology. Danielle frowned. What do you mean? Emily sighed. I mean a miracle. Danielle stared straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. For the first time in her career, she realized she might have made a mistake she couldn't undo. Outside, the plane continued to glide smoothly across the sky. But inside the cabin, the tension had not eased. Passengers were still whispering about what had just happened. Some stole glances toward first class, where Eloise Gardner remained seated, calm as if nothing had ever affected her. Maintaining the composed demeanor she had throughout the incident, Eloise sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Those around her suddenly became more aware of her presence, even though they had ignored her before. Some now bore expressions of guilt, as if realizing they had witnessed something unjust but had said nothing. She did not need their apologies. She had sent a single message and she knew that was enough. At the front of the plane, Captain Pierce sat in the cockpit, his hands firmly gripping the controls with a calm yet resolute expression. The co-pilot glanced at him, then at the screen, where a message from the airline's operations office had just appeared. Urgent. Security team will be waiting at the gate. All crew members involved in the incident must report immediately for review, per orders of Charles Gardner. The co-pilot let out a slow sigh. That doesn't sound good. Pierce didn't take his eyes off the control panel. It's not good for Calloway, that's for sure. A few minutes later, a static noise crackled over the radio. Captain Pierce, this is ground control. Mr. Charles Gardner is requesting a direct connection. The flight continued as the co-pilot glanced at Pierce, knowing this was inevitable. He pressed the button on the radio. Patch him through. There was a brief pause before a voice filled the cockpit, calm, steady, but carrying an unmistakable sense of danger. This is Charles Gardner. The co-pilot immediately tensed, his fingers freezing over the control panel. Pierce cleared his throat slightly. Mr. Gardner, this is Captain Pierce. I assume you've been fully briefed on the situation. I have. Charles's voice was level, unreadable. I want to confirm that the involved flight attendant has been relieved of duty. Pierce nodded. She has been suspended. She is currently seated in the crew area for the remainder of the flight. A long silence followed before Charles spoke again. When you land, she is to be escorted directly to the airline's administrative office. No layover, no debrief with the crew. I want a full report before she leaves the airport. Pierce exchanged a glance with the co-pilot. Understood, sir. Charles's voice remained as calm as ever. And one more thing. Pierce straightened his posture. Yes, sir? Another pause. Then, in a voice so cold it sent a chill down their spines, Charles said. A shiver ran down the captain's back as Charles spoke. Tell Miss Calloway to enjoy her last flight. The radio cut off. Silence filled the cockpit. The co-pilot let out a low whistle. He didn't say her last flight of the day. No, Pierce murmured, adjusting the controls. He didn't. In the crew section at the back, Danielle sat motionless, eyes locked on the floor. She had heard everything. For the first time, true fear crept into her chest. Danielle sat frozen in the cramped crew seat, her heart pounding in her ears. Those words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over like a slow nightmare seeping into reality. Tell Miss Calloway to enjoy her last flight. Her last flight. The meaning was painfully clear. The career she had spent years building. The authority she had once clung to. The sense of control she had always believed she had over passengers. All of it was slipping away right before her eyes. She gripped the edge of her seat, her nails digging into the fabric. No, this couldn't be happening. She had dealt with difficult passengers before. She had enforced regulations. She had even clashed with superiors a few times. But this wasn't just a complaint. Danielle clenched her jaw. There has to be a process, a review, a hearing. Emily shook her head, her voice dropping, almost pitying. No, there doesn't. Danielle's stomach tightened. Emily leaned against the galley counter, whispering, "You think this is just a standard HR complaint? It's not. You laid hands on a passenger. And not just any passenger, that was Eloise Gardner." Danielle opened her mouth to argue, but Emily didn't give her the chance. She didn't call security. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't scream or make a scene. She just sat there, and sent a single message. Emily sighed, regret evident in her eyes. "And now you're erased." The most powerful man in the aviation industry had decided her fate. Danielle felt the pressure in her chest worsening. This was really happening. She had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And there was no way to fix it. The flight continued, the passenger cabin eerily quiet. The first-class passengers no longer made their usual requests. The atmosphere had shifted. It was as if everyone knew what had happened, and what was coming next. Eloise hadn't moved. She sat comfortably in her seat, eyes gazing out the window, as if the storm raging around her had nothing to do with her at all. But maybe there was still one last chance. Danielle forced herself to take a deep breath, then straightened her back. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at Emily. "I'll apologize." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Now?" Danielle nodded quickly, then stood up. "If I tell Mrs. Gardner that I was wrong, if I show her that I regret what I did, maybe?" She hesitated. Maybe Charles Gardner would reconsider. Maybe she could salvage this situation. Without waiting for Emily's reaction, Danielle turned and began walking toward first class. Each step felt heavy, as if she were sinking into the ground. As if she were fighting against her own despair. She had to fix this. But as she reached the front of the passenger cabin, standing beside Eloise's seat, Danielle suddenly realized something. Eloise didn't even look up. She had known Danielle would come. And she wasn't in any hurry to acknowledge her presence. Danielle swallowed dryly, standing beside Eloise's seat, her hands clasped tightly together. The older woman didn't move, didn't turn to face her. She sat there, calm and still, eyes fixed on the window as if Danielle's presence was completely insignificant. The silence was unbearable. Danielle licked her lips, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Gardner," she spoke, striving to remain polite. No response. Nearby passengers started to take notice. Some passengers stole glances, while others didn't bother to hide their curiosity. They could feel it too, the tension thickening the air. Danielle's fingers twitched slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "Mrs. Gardner, I want to apologize." At last, Eloise tilted her head slightly. Just enough to acknowledge that Danielle was standing there. But her gaze remained unreadable, devoid of any emotion. Danielle took a small breath. I realize that I acted inappropriately. I shouldn't have questioned your seat, and I certainly shouldn't have. Her voice trembled, but she pushed herself to finish. "I shouldn't have touched you." Eloise tilted her head a fraction more, observing her. She didn't look angry. But she didn't look satisfied either. Just indifferent. And somehow that was worse. Danielle tried again, her voice carrying a hint of desperation. I truly regret what I did. It was unprofessional, and I hope you can forgive me." Eloise let the silence stretch for what felt like an eternity. Then she slowly turned to face Danielle, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "Forgiveness," she said softly, "does not erase consequences." Danielle's stomach twisted. Eloise leaned back in her seat, hands resting neatly on her lap. "I appreciate your apology, Miss Calloway." Her voice remained calm. "But tell me, are you apologizing because you truly regret what you've done?" Her eyes bore into Danielle's as if she already knew the answer. "Or because you got caught?" Danielle's throat tightened. The surrounding passengers pretended not to hear, but their expressions said it all. Their faces made it clear, they were listening to every word. Danielle hesitated. Eloise raised a single finger. Before you answer, think very carefully. Because if you say the wrong thing right now. She paused, letting the words sink in. It will be the last thing you say as an employee of this airline. Danielle's heart pounded violently in her chest. This woman didn't yell. She didn't make direct threats. But every word she spoke carried the weight of iron. Danielle's entire career was hanging in the balance at this very moment. She had two choices. Admit the truth, take responsibility, and hope that it might make Charles Gardner less severe. Or she could lie, pretend that she truly felt remorse. But somehow she knew, Eloise Gardner would see right through her. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing down like an invisible weight. Danielle clenched her fists at her sides. I'm sorry. Her voice finally came, smaller this time. Not just because I got caught. She swallowed hard. But because I was wrong. Eloise's expression didn't change. Her gaze remained just as sharp, just as steady, carrying an undeniable authority. Danielle's throat felt dry as dust. I shouldn't have treated you with respect. Danielle blurted out, almost rushing her words. I should have thought before I acted. I didn't, and I truly regret it. At last, Eloise tilted her head slightly as if considering. A flicker of hope sparked within Danielle. Maybe she would speak to Charles. Maybe she could convince him to let her keep her job. But then Eloise sighed and shook her head lightly. Danielle felt her heart plummet into a bottomless void. I believe that you regret it, Eloise said simply. But I don't believe you've truly learned anything from this. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. What? Eloise raised a hand, stopping her from speaking further. I'm not the one you need to convince. She glanced down at her phone, tapped the screen once and then slipped it into her handbag. And I've said everything I needed to say. Danielle's mouth parted slightly but no words came out. That was it. Eloise had decided her fate. Danielle felt her palms grow slick with sweat. Her vision blurred as panic tightened its grip on her mind. She had thought that if she apologized, if she swallowed her pride, it would be enough. But Eloise had never been the one who truly held her career in her hands. Charles Gardner was the one with the power to decide. And he was waiting for her on the ground. Danielle took a shaky breath. She took an unsteady step back. Her legs felt as if they were about to give out as she turned away from Eloise. The whispers resumed as she made her way toward the crew area. The voices of the passengers were no longer even trying to be discreet. She's done for. I almost feel sorry for her, almost. Danielle clenched her fists. She wasn't ready to give up. But that no longer mattered. Because the moment the plane touched down, she would have no choice left. The cabin grew eerily silent as the plane began its descent. The gentle tilt downward was almost imperceptible amidst the thick tension hanging in the air. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening their seatbelts as the overhead announcement reminded them to prepare for landing. But Danielle heard nothing except the pounding of her own heartbeat. She sat in the jump seat, her vacant eyes staring at the floor. Her fingers clutched at her uniform so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had completely lost control. Her mind spun, desperately searching for an escape, a way to salvage the situation. One last chance to avoid the disaster waiting for her at the gate. But no matter how she turned it over in her head, Danielle could only reach one conclusion. There was no way out. She had tried to apologize. She had tried to swallow her pride. But it was all meaningless because Charles Gardner had already made his decision. Her fate was sealed. Emily stood near the beverage cart, quietly watching Danielle from a distance. She had seen many crew members get into trouble before, those who made mistakes, those who broke the rules. But this wasn't something that could be brushed aside. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. Are you okay? Danielle let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. No. Emily sighed. I figured as much. Danielle ran a hand over her face, her fingers trembling slightly. Maybe I can still talk to him. Maybe if I explain that, it was just what? Emily cut in, her voice quiet but firm. Danielle looked up. Emily's expression was unreadable. What are you going to say? That it was a misunderstanding? That you were just following procedure? Emily tilted her head slightly, her tone sharp as ice. Because that won't work, and you know it. Danielle swallowed dryly, her throat parched. Emily leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving Danielle's. She rested against the galley counter, arms crossed over her chest. Do you really not understand why this is happening? Danielle frowned. Of course I understand. Emily shook her head. I don't think you do. Her arms remained folded, her gaze sharp. You didn't just take someone's seat by mistake, Danielle. You didn't just mix up a boarding pass. You looked at her and immediately decided she didn't belong in first class. Danielle flinched. That's not. Emily raised an eyebrow. Then what was it? Danielle had no answer. Because they both knew the truth. Emily sighed, pressing her fingers against her temple. I don't think you meant for this to spiral this far. But the fact that it did, means you have to take responsibility. Danielle took a sharp breath, shaking her head. Even if I take responsibility, it won't change anything. I'm done, aren't I? Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The plane trembled slightly as the landing gear deployed. The captain's voice echoed through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts, return your tray tables to the upright position. We are now in our final approach. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Touchdown. Danielle sat completely still, her breathing shallow and uneven. This was the end. She had spent years in the airline industry, believing she was untouchable, that she had the power to decide who belonged where, who deserved to be treated in what way. But now she was about to step off this plane with nothing. She clenched her jaw, trying to suppress the rising panic creeping into every fiber of her being. She had once been the enforcer of rules, the one making announcements, the one in control, while passengers had no choice but to listen. But today she was no longer in control. Today she was the one being removed. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, rolling smoothly along the runway. A few passengers clapped half-heartedly, a habit even when the flight was unremarkable. To Danielle the sound felt like a mockery. She barely registered anything as the plane slowed, taxiing towards the gate. Her body was numb, as if she were watching this moment from outside herself. Then the final announcement came over the loudspeaker. Welcome to our destination. Local time is 3:45 p.m. Please? The woman stood right beside him, Eloise Gardner. She stood there, composed, without a word, but her piercing gaze spoke volumes. Danielle felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't a regular disciplinary meeting. This was a trial right at the plane's door, and she was the accused. Passengers continued to disembark, some passing by without a glance, but most turned their heads, casting sidelong glances, waiting to see her fate. Emily quietly performed her duties but avoided looking at Danielle. Danielle clenched her hands, trying to maintain her composure as she moved step by step towards the door. Everything was happening in slow motion, each second stretching out endlessly. And then she stopped right in front of Charles Gardner. No one spoke. Then, in a calm but irrefutable voice, Charles said, "Miss Calloway, please come with us." Danielle swallowed hard, her heart pounding, but she knew she had no choice. She took a deep breath and stepped through the door, leaving the plane, not as a flight attendant, but as someone who had lost everything. The fact that two uniformed security officers stood beside him sent a wave of whispers through the first-class cabin. Some passengers froze, others leaned forward for a better view. Eloise Gardner remained composed, slowly gathering her belongings as if she had all the time in the world and nothing to worry about. Danielle felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just a meeting. It wasn't just a disciplinary review. She was about to be escorted off the plane in front of everyone, like a criminal. And then it suddenly dawned on her, this wasn't just about losing her job. It was a cautionary tale. A stark example for anyone who dared to overstep their boundaries. Danielle stood frozen in the crew jump seat, her body refusing to move. The plane door yawned open before her, like an abyss waiting to swallow her whole. Charles Gardner hadn't budged. He stood just outside the exit, his posture relaxed but his eyes revealing nothing. The executives surrounding him were rigid, their expressions cold and professional. The two security officers stood on either side, maintaining a silent but powerful presence. The kind of power that only appears when someone is about to be forcibly removed from a flight. The moment was unbearably tense, as if the entire plane had held its breath. First-class passengers had all turned their heads forward, some openly watching, others pretending to fiddle with their luggage while sneaking glances. Even those who previously didn't care what was happening were now completely absorbed in the situation. This wasn't merely a disembarkation. It was a judgment. Danielle swallowed hard, forcing herself to move, but her legs were stiff, as if her body was resisting the humiliation waiting at the aircraft door. Emily stood near the galley, observing the entire scene. She said nothing, but her expression spoke volumes. She knew. She knew this wasn't just a simple escort off the airport grounds. This was Charles Gardner's way of making an example. Danielle's chest tightened. Perhaps if she had spoken up sooner, if she had explained, if she had just said something. But before she could open her mouth, Charles Gardner finally moved. With slow, deliberate steps, he advanced and blocked the plane's exit. His eyes settled on Danielle. "Miss Calloway." Her stomach dropped. His voice wasn't loud, nor was it threatening, but it didn't need to be. There was a sharp control in every word, an authority that didn't require raising his voice. Danielle straightened her back, trying to salvage the last bit of her dignity. "Mr. Gardner," she said cautiously. Charles's expression didn't change. He didn't look at her with anger, nor was he impressed by her sudden change in demeanor. He simply tilted his head slightly. "I assume you know why I'm here." Danielle's fingers twitched at her side. She couldn't afford to give the wrong answer. She cleared her throat. "I understand there was an incident, and I deeply regret any misunderstanding with your wife." "Stop." Danielle's words caught in her throat. Charles gave her a meaningful look. "This isn't a matter of misunderstanding. And I don't care about your regrets." The entire cabin was dead silent. Passengers, crew, even the captain who had just emerged from the cockpit stood frozen. Danielle felt like the ground was slipping away beneath her. Charles exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "What I care about is why you thought you had the right to lay hands on a passenger?" Danielle's heart pounded violently. He went straight to the worst point, the undeniable point. She opened her mouth trying to find a defense, but her mind was blank. How could she explain it? How could she justify the unjustifiable? Her hesitation was the answer Charles needed. He nodded once, turning to one of the airline executives. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice utterly calm. "Danielle Calloway is permanently terminated from this airline." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Danielle gasped, barely able to process what she had just heard. "Wait," Charles raised his hand. "We're not done yet." Danielle's legs felt weak. He turned back to her. "You will be escorted off this flight immediately. Your contract is terminated. Your employment record will clearly state that you were dismissed for violating the code of conduct." The murmurs behind her grew louder. Passengers were gossiping, some reacting openly. Danielle's heart pounded. "Mr. Gardner, please, Charles?" Charles's expression finally shifted, a flicker of amusement flashing in his eyes. Danielle froze. It was the look of someone who had heard these pleas too many times, someone who had seen others beg to take back what they had done. "You want a second chance?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Danielle nodded quickly. I do." Charles observed her, as if considering something. Then he let out a laugh, a decidedly unfriendly one. "You had a chance," he said simply. "The moment you looked at my wife and decided she didn't belong there." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. Charles took another step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You could have stopped at questioning her seat assignment," he whispered. "You could have stopped at making her prove she had a first-class ticket." His eyes darkened. "But you didn't. You made a choice, Miss Calloway." Danielle felt a tremor run through her body. "You thought you had power over her," Charles continued, his voice as cold as steel. "And now you have nothing." Danielle was speechless. She knew in that moment that this wasn't just about losing her job. Her career was over. No matter where she tried to apply, this would follow her forever. No airline, no reputable company. No company in this industry would risk hiring someone who had been fired by Charles Gardner himself. Danielle's breathing became rapid, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. Charles took a step back and simply nodded to the security officers. "Take her off the plane." Danielle's legs felt weak as one of the security officers gently but firmly gestured for her to move. She didn't. She couldn't. But she had no choice. The passengers were now openly staring, some even raising their phones as they whispered to each other. Danielle's face burned with shame. She had spent years enforcing the rules on these planes, and now she was being led away like a problem to be dealt with. Each step towards the exit seemed heavier, the whispers growing louder. The stares were unbearable. And just as she passed Eloise Gardner's seat, she heard a calm, patient voice. "I hope you'll remember this." Eloise spoke casually, her eyes still fixed out the window. Danielle felt her stomach drop into an abyss. She forced herself to keep walking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. As she stepped off the plane, feeling her entire career crumble, Danielle knew one thing for sure. She would never forget this moment. Because Charles Gardner hadn't just fired her. He had erased her. Danielle walked onto the jet bridge, her legs trembling, her hands clammy with sweat. The air in the enclosed tunnel was thick, suffocating, but she couldn't stop. The two security officers flanked her, staying close enough to make sure she understood. She was no longer in control. She was no longer a respected crew member. No longer someone with authority. Now she was just a problem to be removed. Each step grew heavier, the distant hum of the airport muffled by the ringing in her ears as the reality sank in. She wasn't just losing her job. She was losing everything. Her reputation. Her career. The respect she had built over years. All gone. And the worst part was she had destroyed it herself. She recalled the moment she first saw Eloise Gardner on the plane, how she had instantly assumed Eloise didn't belong there. The way she had questioned, belittled, and ultimately humiliated her. Danielle had thought she held the power in that moment. But in reality she was only digging her own grave. They reached the end of the jet bridge, where a team of airline management was waiting. A stern-looking woman in a navy blue suit held a tablet, looking up as they approached. Her name tag read, Rebecca Lynn, Senior Flight Operations Manager. She barely glanced at Danielle, turning to one of the security officers. "She'll come with me," Rebecca said coldly. Danielle opened her mouth, trying to find something, anything, to change the situation, but Rebecca had already turned away, assuming Danielle would follow. Danielle swallowed the lump of humiliation in her throat and complied. The journey through the airport terminal was just as brutal as the moment she was escorted off the plane. Passengers were still moving, some rushing to catch flights, others waiting at gates, oblivious to the storm raging inside Danielle. A few, only a few, had been on the flight. A few had witnessed the whole incident and recognized her. Danielle could feel their eyes on her. Some stared openly, others whispered behind their hands. Some even raised their phones, pretending to check notifications but actually taking photos. Danielle's stomach churned. She had been the enforcer, the one implementing airline policies, the one dealing with disruptive passengers. But now she was the story. A viral article, waiting to be written. She lowered her head, her nails digging into her palms. Perhaps, just perhaps, if she maintained a calm exterior she could salvage something from this mess. Rebecca led her to a private elevator, swiping a card to grant access to a restricted area of the airport. The doors closed behind them, sealing the two of them in a tense silence. Danielle forced herself to speak. "Ms. Lynn," she began, keeping her voice calm and professional, as if she still had a right to a normal conversation. Rebecca didn't look at her. She merely glanced at the tablet, scrolling through some report. Danielle hesitated, but pressed on. "I understand Mr. Gardner is very upset, and I take full responsibility for what happened." Rebecca's sharp, decisive exhale cut her off. Finally she looked up. Her eyes were cold and sharp. "Miss Calloway," Rebecca said, her voice firm but calm. "This isn't a disciplinary meeting." Danielle frowned. Rebecca's gaze hardened. "There's no performance review. No suspension. No formal process for you to defend yourself." She tilted the tablet slightly towards Danielle. "It's over." Danielle's heart pounded as she looked at the screen. The termination letter. Pre-written. Signed. Effective immediately. Her hand trembled as she stared at the words. There has to be another way?" Rebecca didn't let her finish. "You are permanently banned from working for this airline effective today." She swiped the screen, opening another document. "And at the direct request of Mr. Gardner, your personnel file has been flagged." Danielle's stomach clenched. A red flag. A permanent stain on her record. A mark that would appear every time she applied for a job anywhere in the airline industry. Danielle heard the words, but her ears were ringing. Every future job application. Every background check. She had heard of cases like this before. Only the worst incidents led to being flagged in the system. This wasn't just a dismissal. This was a lifetime ban. Rebecca stared at her, her gaze unwavering. "You will not be employed by any airline within our corporation. Your name has been sent to all other major airlines under industry agreements." She glanced at the screen. That list includes over 40 airlines globally. Danielle's vision blurred. No. This wasn't just about losing her job. This was the end of her career. The airline industry was too small, too interconnected, too tightly knit. Once flagged, she was essentially blacklisted forever. Her experience was meaningless. The flights she had served were worthless. Nothing mattered anymore. She swayed, grabbing the elevator handrail to steady herself. Rebecca remained unmoved. "You will be escorted to the crew office to collect your personal belongings. Then you will be taken directly out of the airport, where you will return your uniform and employee badge." Danielle's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to do. Rebecca tapped the tablet screen and looked up at Danielle, her voice as calm as if she were stating an obvious fact. You will never be permitted to board any of our flights again. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. 2 more security officers stood waiting. Danielle took a breath, her legs trembling as she stepped out of the elevator. The full weight of her mistakes crashed down on her all at once. She had never imagined her career ending like this. But what was worse than losing her job? She realized she had never been untouchable. She had believed she could do anything as long as she had seniority, as long as she had authority. But no one is untouchable. Especially when the power she thought she had never truly belonged to her. Danielle's steps became slow, heavy, as if she were walking towards her own execution. The hallway stretched ahead, white, sterile, cold. On either side were opaque glass doors, behind which were closed offices. The airline's administrative offices. With every few steps she passed familiar colleagues. Pilots. Flight attendants. Ground staff. Some recognized her immediately. Some others only saw the security detail escorting her, and immediately understood what had happened. Some looked at her with sympathy. Others flashed looks of glee. Danielle had made her share of enemies over the years. If it had been any other day she might have completely dismissed Ethan Vaughn. But now he was the one handling her termination. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. Ethan gave a professional, strained smile, but there was no warmth in it. Just the coldness of procedural formality. Miss Calloway. He glanced at the security officers and nodded towards a door to the side. We'll complete the final steps of your termination in here. Danielle didn't move immediately. She still couldn't believe this was happening. Just yesterday she had been a respected lead flight attendant, giving orders, supervising crew members, making decisions. And now she stood here in an office like a criminal, waiting to be processed out of the only career she had ever known. The humiliation was unbearable. Ethan cleared his throat, a gentle but powerful reminder that she had no choice. Danielle swallowed her pride, forcing herself to move and step into the small, windowless meeting room. The door behind her clicked softly, locking. She sat down in the chair opposite Ethan, who wordlessly pushed the termination file towards her. He slid the file across to her. The file was thick, filled with airline policies, official statements, and legal clauses. Right at the top, in bold, unyielding letters, employment termination, effective immediately. Danielle's fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. Ethan spoke, his voice calm as if he had said these words 100 times before. By signing here, you acknowledge that you have been formally terminated from your position due to violation of the code of conduct, including inappropriate physical contact with a passenger. Danielle's chest tightened. Hearing the words spoken so clearly, coldly, made everything more real than ever. She had spent her career disciplining others, writing up crew members, watching people get suspended or fired for their mistakes. She had never imagined that one day she would be sitting on this side of the table. Ethan continued, you also acknowledge that you will not seek reinstatement, nor apply for employment at any airline within our parent corporation. Danielle's vision blurred. This wasn't just about being fired. This was a lifetime ban. Just days ago she had been a respected member of the crew, working in first class, handling VIP passengers, and now she wasn't even sure she could find another job. Danielle's voice was weak, almost pleading. Is there any way to appeal? Ethan didn't even have to think. No. The firm refusal hit her like a final sentence. Danielle's stomach churned. She felt as if she were falling into an endless abyss with no way out. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen, but she forced herself to sign the document. Ethan took back the file, flipping through each page, ensuring everything was complete and accurate. Then, without a trace of emotion, he said, you'll need to return your uniform and employee badge before you leave. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. This uniform had been a part of her for years. She had worn it as she boarded hundreds of flights, greeted thousands of passengers, performed countless safety procedures, supervised and commanded her crew with confidence and authority. It wasn't just a uniform, it was a symbol of her status, her honor, the entire career she had built. And now she had to take it off. Ethan probably noticed her hesitation, but he simply said in a calm, unemotional voice, without a hint of sympathy or comfort, there's a changing room at the end of the hall. The security officer standing beside her shifted slightly, a silent but clear gesture. She had no choice. Danielle stood up, her movements stiff as if her whole body was frozen. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging painfully into her palms, but she didn't let go. She walked out of the office, past the airline staff, People who once respected her, who greeted her with admiration, now they just stood there silently watching. Some glanced at her with curiosity, others turned away, but she could clearly feel the changed atmosphere. Danielle Calloway, the veteran flight attendant, the one who held a high position, who commanded the crew, was now just a disgraced figure, a story to gossip about, a lesson for those who thought they were untouchable. She walked past the people who once respected her, past those who admired her, and those who were now witnessing her downfall. Danielle reached the changing room, opened the door and stepped inside. As the door closed behind her, she turned the lock. For the first time since this all began, her entire body trembled. This was the end. Her hands were numb as she unpinned her name tag, gently placing it on the counter. The uniform she had worn with pride, the outfit that had made her feel important, powerful, untouchable, was now just a shell, a costume she no longer had the right to wear. She changed slowly, each movement stiff and lifeless. When she stepped out, she was no longer Danielle Calloway, the veteran flight attendant. She was just Danielle. And she had never felt so small. She returned to the office, handing the uniform and her employee badge to Ethan, then stood waiting. Ethan took them without a word, then simply nodded to the security officer. That's it. Danielle shuddered slightly at the way he said it, as if she were just another case, a problem that had been resolved. One of the security officers gestured towards the exit. This way, Miss Calloway. Danielle turned slowly, trying to keep her back straight, trying to project a semblance of dignity. But as she walked through the terminal, feeling the eyes of the passengers on her, she knew they had all seen. They had seen her leave the plane in disgrace. They had seen her stripped of her title, her power, her career. Her name, her face, they would remember. And no matter where she went, no matter how much time passed, this would follow her. She had spent years controlling others. But now she couldn't even control her own future. Because as she stepped through the final doors of this airport, she had nothing left. Danielle walked through the automatic glass doors, the outside air rushing in, slapping her face like a cold rebuke. For a brief moment, she just stood there, her fingers clenching the strap of her bag until they were numb. She didn't know what to do. For years she had always known her next step, the next flight, the next schedule, the next crew. Her life had been planned, structured, ordered. But now she only had the vast unknown ahead. But now there was nothing. Her career was over. Her name was tarnished in the industry. She wasn't even allowed to board one of the planes she used to command. She looked around, hoping that anger would rise in her chest, hoping that this injustice would burn her from the inside. But no, she didn't feel anger. She only felt empty. Around her, passengers continued to rush, hurrying towards taxis, shuttles, loved ones waiting at the curb. People were still coming and going. For them, today was just another ordinary day. But for her, everything had changed. She turned, looking back, looking at her airport. The place where she had built her career. The place she used to dominate. The place that had just thrown her out as if she were nothing. She had believed she was untouchable, that nothing could touch her. Her position, her experience, her power, they would protect her forever. But it turned out, all it took was one mistake. Just one moment of arrogance. One moment of cruelty. One uncontrolled abuse of power. She had thought that passengers were the ones without power. That they were beneath her. That they could only listen, obey, accept. But now she was the one without any power. Life went on. But for her, everything had stopped. Danielle stood silently at the curb, her empty gaze following the bustling scene of the airport's pickup area. Taxis pulled up one after another. Car doors popped open. Passengers rushed in and out. A stern mother scolded her child for pulling the suitcase the wrong way. A businessman stood impatiently, his fingers tapping incessantly on his phone screen. A couple embraced tightly, perhaps after a long period of separation. Life went on. But for her, everything had collapsed. Eloise Gardner didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to humiliate her in front of anyone. She only had to wait. Just one message to her husband. And that was enough to destroy Danielle's entire world. She sighed, her breath trembling and breaking. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't even know who she was anymore. For so long her job had been her identity. Her uniform was her armor. Her position was what made her feel valuable. Now that it had all been stripped away, what was left? Danielle turned and walked towards the road ahead. For the first time she truly understood, she was no longer a flight attendant. She was no longer respected. She was no longer in control of anything. She was now just Danielle Calloway. Someone with nowhere to go. No one waiting for her. Danielle stared at her phone screen, the pale blue light reflecting on her face. No messages. No missed calls. Not a single inquiry. No one asked where she was. No one cared how she was. No one was waiting for her return. Her whole life had been dedicated to this job. But now that she had lost everything, the world didn't even shake. She was no longer a powerful flight attendant. No longer someone who commanded staff, yelled at crew members, made decisions on luxurious flights. She was just a stranger lost in life. The taxi driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Do you need to go somewhere, ma'am?" Danielle blinked. For a moment she thought about getting into the car. Running away. Running away from this airport. Running away from the malicious eyes watching her. Running away from the nightmare she had created for herself. But then she realized a painful truth: she had nowhere to go. No plans. No way back. Nothing belonged to her anymore. She shook her head. "No. I'm fine." The driver shrugged and the car rolled away, its taillights fading into the busy traffic. Danielle stood there, phone in hand, feeling empty. And for the first time in her life, she was truly alone. No messages. No missed calls. No inquiries from colleagues. Danielle stared at her phone screen, her fingers tightening around the metal frame. She had been so thoroughly erased, it was as if she had never existed at the airline. She gritted her teeth, scrolling through her contacts. She had connections in the airline industry, people she had worked with for years. Maybe someone somewhere could help her find a new position. Maybe she could get ahead of the news, try to salvage the situation before it spread too quickly. Her finger stopped on the first name in her call history, a former supervisor from another airline, someone who had always respected her work ethic, someone she had trained when he was new to the job. She pressed call. The ringing tone sounded once, twice. "The number you have dialed is currently unavailable." Danielle tightened her grip on the phone. She tried calling another number. The same thing. Another number. Voicemail. Her breath quickened, her heart pounding. They were blocking her. The airline industry was small. News traveled faster than she had anticipated. Charles Gardner hadn't just fired her. He had ensured she could never return. Panic began to churn in her chest, cold and ruthless. Danielle continued to scroll through her contacts, desperately searching for someone, anyone. Someone who could help her. Someone who could pull her out of this nightmare. But no one answered. Who would answer her? Danielle pressed call on another number, someone she had believed she could rely on. This time the call connected. Her heart leaped. "Hello? It's me," she said quickly, her voice full of hope. I need to talk. Something happened." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a small, hesitant voice spoke. "Danielle?" Just one word, but the hesitation in it made her blood run cold. "What's wrong?" she asked, forcing a nervous laugh. "Why do you sound so strange?" A sigh came from the other end. I don't think I should get involved in this." The voice admitted, faltering. "I heard what happened. I think it's best if I keep my distance." Danielle's heart seemed to stop. She opened her mouth to say something, but click. The call ended. She stared at the phone screen, her throat tight. Every name in her contact list suddenly seemed faded. They were all gone. Every relationship she had built. Every favor she had exchanged. Everyone who had respected her, who had relied on her. It all meant nothing now. She was truly, utterly alone. Her hands hung limply at her sides, empty. She had spent her career making people respect her, fear her, obey her. She had casually pushed people aside, ignored them. Their concerns, their complaints, she had dismissed them all, treated people as if they were inferior to her. And now, when she truly needed someone by her side, there was no one. She stood there in the airport where she was no longer allowed to work, calling people who would never answer, watching the life she had built crumble through her fingers like sand. For the first time, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. This wasn't just about losing her job, but perhaps this was the end of everything. Everything she had strived for, believed in, relied on for years. Without her career, what did she have left? A cold wind swept through the terminal, biting at her skin. Danielle looked up at the airport, her airport. But no, it was no longer hers. She turned away, walking towards an uncertain future. And it was then that she realized a truth worse than losing her job. She had lost herself. Danielle kept walking, the airport noises fading behind her. She didn't know where she was going. No plans. No one to call. Nothing but the ordinary clothes on her back and a phone with a contact list of names that now meant nothing. She walked for a long time, not knowing how far she had gone until her legs began to ache. When she looked up, she realized she was standing in front of a small roadside cafe. People inside were laughing, typing on laptops, sipping hot coffees. A world she had never paid attention to before. She stepped inside, ordered a hot tea, something she had never done before because she was always rushing with a packed schedule. As she held the tea in her hands, feeling the warmth spread, she realized something. For the first time in a long time, she had nowhere to rush. No flights to check. No passengers to serve. No pressure to control everything. She looked out at the street. For the first time she really stopped to observe. A group of students laughed as they passed by. An old woman was selling flowers on the corner. A middle-aged man was busy on his phone, his face full of worry. Everyone had their own story. What about her? She had lost everything. But perhaps this was a chance to start over. Danielle took out her phone, deleting all her old contacts. The people who hadn't stood by her, who had turned their backs when she needed them most. She opened an online job search page. She was no longer a flight attendant. But that didn't mean she couldn't be someone else. She clicked on the search bar, thought for a moment, then began to type.